Hello, and welcome to Travel Leaders Podcast. I'm Caroline Bremner, the Head of Travel Research at Euromonitor International. And today I'm delighted to be joined by Jeremy Smith, the co-founder of Tourism Declares a Climate Emergency. Hi, Jeremy. How are you doing?
Hi there, Caroline. I'm doing great. Thank you very much for inviting me to chat with you today.
Oh, you're welcome. And obviously, with Tourism Declares has been heavily involved with the COP26. So how was Glasgow?
It was, from my perspective, it was wonderful. I had a really inspiring time, but I was very involved in what we were doing and thus didn't really get a chance to soak up the wider plenary sessions, let's say.
And it would be great to hear, so why essentially were you there at Tourism Declares, and sort of what has really taken you from Tourism Declares to now about launching the Glasgow Declaration? It'd be great to hear the journey that you've been on, and then also to hear a lot more about what specifically happened at COP26.
Okay, so if we take it back a couple of years, in January 2020, a few of us launched an initiative called Tourism Declares a Climate Emergency, known commonly nowadays as Tourism Declares. And it came out of sort of continuing conversations about frustration, how fragmented our industry's response was to the climate emergency, and feeling that we lacked coordination, clarity on how to act. And yet the emergency was only, and continues, as we see, right now, it only continues to get worse. And we felt there was a need, we continue to feel there was a need to be able to support and engage all parts of our industry, and obviously it's a very complicated industry, in what necessary science-based climate action looks like. We would want to do this really because there's an industry that commonly says that we have a responsibility for 1 in 10 jobs, or influence over 1 in 10 jobs, and 10% of GDP. That makes it a huge responsibility. We have a sizable impact. It's said that tourism's emissions are between 8 and 11% of global emissions, which, if we were a country, that would make us the third largest country emissions in the world. But also because of the risks. You only have to see the appalling scenes happening in British Columbia today, or pick your month of the last year, from wildfires to floods, et cetera, all across the world, to see the risks, because everywhere that these things are happening are places that people love to go on holiday. But finally, because there's a positive thing as well, that tourism takes people into the natural world, engages with the natural world, and therefore there's an opportunity for us to see the benefits of a more responsible, engaged with restoring nature, engaged with regenerating habitats and ecosystems, way of behaving. And we wanted to address these things.
Yes. Obviously, it's where we're sitting in the UK. We can see elements of climate change, but you're absolutely right. Sort of the developing world is so at risk, isn't it? And so how do you sort of square that circle with say, the visitors, so that they just don't think, well, I deserve a holiday, I deserve a break, so I'm just going to go somewhere and I won't care about, my impact. How do you also bring consumers on board, so as well, on that journey?
That's a really difficult, that's possibly the hardest of all questions. And we haven't, up until now, focused on the consumer. We have very much focused on an internal, or sort of a conversation between the industry, talking to one another, the industry and the places, the destinations where we operate. We didn't want to build something that became a label, certainly not too quickly. We wanted to ensure that what we are doing is something that is grounded in the reality of organizational change. So we haven't been engaging consumers in conversations around this.
I guess it has to start somewhere, and it seems that there's a real sort of sense of momentum with what you've achieved. If we think about how many signatories have signed up to Tourism Declares. What's the number as it stands today?
Tourism Declares, I wouldn't be able to tell you what today is, but it's somewhere just over 400 signatories or members of Tourism Declares. And that started, if you think, when we launched in January 2020, we launched with 14 founder signatories who were mostly tour operators, coming together and publishing a climate emergency declaration on their websites, and all making the same commitment to develop their business to align with the needs of climate science, which, as we increasingly see said, is that we need to cut global emissions in half by 2030 to reach net zero as fast as possible, and certainly no later than 2050. And that we need, that this can't be something we do in competition or in silos, that we need to come together and share our challenges, share our best practice, and work as one. And that has grown from there over the, we launched in January 2020. And of course, from March 2020, the conversation shifted very rapidly towards COVID. And for the travel industry, as with many other industries, COVID has been, devastating. And that has changed the conversation that we were able to have. But we have continued to grow our numbers, grow the diversity of representation of who is signed up, way beyond just tour operators to accommodation, to travel agents, consultants, certification bodies, and increasingly inside of destinations themselves.
And obviously, there was some really exciting news around Tourism Declares at COP26, where you announced that you were coming under the umbrella of the Travel Foundation, and you also launched the Glasgow Declaration. Can you unpick some of that for us so that we can understand why this is such an important moment?
Well, it's an important moment for so there's two pieces. If you take the Travel Foundation piece, first of all the work that Tourism Declares has done up until now has been done by a group of volunteers, and we've received no external funding. We have done it either through in the evenings, at the weekend, in our spare time, or because of the reality that COVID has meant that an awful lot of very talented people have found themselves on reduced or out of work, and they've come together and said, let's work together to do what we can. And that has been how Tourism Declares has grown. That has been an amazingly inspiring part of, certainly for me, of the last 2 years of my life. However, it has also meant that when our conversations have as we have grown and our momentum has built and our numbers have built, we've had conversations with larger organizations, bigger destinations, and often the question that we get asked is, great momentum, well done for doing what you're doing, like your framework, like your approach, but are you going to be here in 2 years' time? Where is your structure? Where's your governance? Where's your ability to scale and to take in funding? And that obviously is a fair question. And we have been trying to work out how best to address that conversation and that question rather. And during the last few months, across the whole of this year and a bit earlier last year, we've been working closely with people inside of the Travel Foundation, in particular with Jeremy Sampson, the CEO, and working very closely indeed with them on a daily basis on the Glasgow Declaration that we'll get to in a second. Now, the Travel Foundation had decided recently that their focus going forward was going to be on two pillars, on equity and on climate, but they needed to develop a climate program. We are a climate program who is focused on equity, and what we needed was organizational support. And both organizations, or both our initiative and their organization, are focused on avoiding fragmentation, on ensuring alignment, on avoiding duplication. So we rapidly came to the conclusion that the last thing we wanted to do was to create two climate programs and two organizations. What made sense was to bring ourselves together. So that was why we announced at COP that we would be doing exactly that. In terms of the Glasgow Declaration, and to some degree it is there to answer similar questions, which is, how do you scale the framework of Tourism Declares in order to address all the challenges that we have encountered in the first 2 years of our growth? And that is about, how do you bring on board larger organizations, larger countries? How do you ensure the due diligence? How do you ensure the accountability? How do you guarantee to people who are concerned that it's just another pledge, that it's not just another pledge, that this is something that has legs, long-term sustainability, organizational weight behind it? And the answer to that was to work with the Travel Foundation, with the UNWTO, the United Nations World Tourism Organization, with UNEP, United Nations Environment Programme, and Visit Scotland over the course of the last several months on taking the initial framework of Tourism Declares, building on it, developing it, and drafting it into the Glasgow Declaration that now lives on the One Planet Network website, which is a website put together through various UN bodies to deliver on the science and the Sustainable Development Goals around sustainable consumption and production, and bring with it all that sort of support.
Great. And I just wondered, because obviously it would be interesting to hear, you mentioned that it started with the tour operators. So, we have the sort of pioneers such as Intrepid and the Travel Corp, and now it's sort of rolled out to destinations and lodging, etc. Are there, for you, who are the sort of the standout signatories, or do you see that everybody that signs up is equal and it's more just about building that mass and getting that momentum going?
Definitely, we welcome every signature and every person and every company and every destination and every organization, because we all have a role to play in it. And I wouldn't like to say that one was more important than another, because this isn't all, we're all in it together. We all have to take collective responsibility for our actions. So yeah, I mean, in that sense, I wouldn't want to single anyone out, but I am going to single a few out because I think it's emblematic of addressing the challenges that Tourism Declares needed to set out and address. And the first part of that would be to say that we had several countries who joined and signed the Glasgow Declaration. Initially, a year ago, Scotland, or Visit Scotland, became the first national tourism organisation to sign Tourism Declares 1 year in advance of hosting COP. And since then, the Ukrainian National Tourism Organisation has also joined, but no others had. What we saw at COP with the Glasgow Declaration was that Panama, Micronesia, Kiribati, Barbados, the Organization of Eastern Caribbean States that represents islands across the Caribbean, basically are in the heart of the hurricane belt, and also Norway and the Netherlands all came on board and all signed there and then. And we're in conversation with other countries. And what you see is that all those countries, especially the ones from the global south, are ones feeling the impacts of climate change the most. Low-lying islands in the Pacific, Caribbean islands, Panama, that is one of the only 3 countries in the world that is considered to be carbon negative, along with Bhutan and Gabon. I mean, to me, that was incredibly important for focusing where we move forward. At the same time, to balance that, one of the challenges we'd had in many conversations through Tourism Declares over the years was when we talked with larger organizations. You rightly highlighted the work of Intrepid and the Travel Corporation as being large organizations who'd come on board. Six Senses, the hotel chain, had also joined Tourism Declares in the last few months, and all of those should be applauded for what they've done. But what we saw at at COP, was Accor, a huge hotel company with 250,000 members, Skyscanner, Iberostar. All these companies came on right at the beginning, and we've seen in the last couple of weeks since COP, we launched with 302 or 3 founder signatories. Already there's another 100 signatories that have come on board in the 10 days or so subsequent to COP. So we're up 400 plus signatories now, with more just sort of going through due diligence. And included in those was the likes of Deutsche Bahn, the German national railways.
Gosh, that's really impressive. And so for the signatories, obviously we know that there is the greater good, but what will they also get out of joining the Glasgow Declaration? Say, for example, Euromonitor, we signed up to the Future of Tourism Coalition, and it does feel like the next step would be for us to also join Glasgow. So, what would be the kind of pitch to make us, take that next step?
Well, I'd like to hope, but I believe that the Glasgow Declaration answers, I think I've said more than once, answers the questions that tourism declares set out to answer at the beginning of a fragmented approach and people lacking clarity on what to do. That it answers the questions that then were posed to tourism declares about having the organizational structure in place, having the long-term ability to sustain this over the course of the decade through to 2030 when we need to cut emissions in half. The fact that as well as the companies that have signed, there were three categories for people to sign the Glasgow Declaration. Category 1 is as a business, category 2 is as a destination, and category 3 is as a supporting organization. And you would say, you might argue that Euromonitor is a supporting organization. Doesn't have its own specific footprint in the same way as a hotel does, but has a huge opportunity to scale and to catalyze change. And you see that inside of the sort of supporting organizations that have joined, none more so than WTTC, the World Travel and Trade Tourism Council, that have come together. And so you do have inside of this, the largest body representing the private sector in WTTC, the largest body representing destinations inside of the UNWTO, all both getting to COP26 and saying in their calls to action, this is the way forward. So for someone saying, what is the way forward? What should I be doing? It's like, well, start by looking here, because you can see that the support is there. You can, it is aligned with UNFCCC, so that's the UNF climate, basically UN climate. It's supported by Race to Zero. And the more companies and destinations that sign, the more we build a network of support for one another, and we are able to build a supply chains, build our value chains along with those who are delivering, who are on the same pathway, who are committed to collaborate, committed to share, committing to publish transparently their progress and how they can meet their challenges. Because in the end, we're all facing our own version of the same challenge. And the more we can be working in an aligned way, and that is very much what the framework of the Glasgow Declaration sets out to do, the more likely we are to be able to lend one another support, lean on each other's experiences.
Yeah, it's almost like, why would you not sign it? It just seems such an obvious thing, doesn't it? So, but anyway, I mean, it's such a great achievement that you've all sort of come together and launched the Glasgow Declaration. And I guess what happens next? What specifically are you going to be doing, and also what are your broader plans for tourism declares, and how's that going to play out over the next year or so?
It's been a huge amount of work getting to where we got to at COP26, and there was a sort of dawning realization amongst several of us who'd been sort of most involved in it as the penny dropped and the moment happened, that really that wasn't the end, that was the beginning, and that we just that was the launch, not the closing party. And that all conversations that I have with those people who I've been working with in the last few months have now shifted to what does success look like at COP27, takes place in Cairo next year. And we know that the framework is about cutting our industry's emissions in half by 2030. In a year's time, we're a year nearer 2030. If our emissions have gone in the wrong direction, we've made the following 7-8 years all the harder. We need to, it isn't enough just to get to COP27 with more signatories, a louder declaration. We need to actually show, yes, momentum, of course, yes, buy-in, yes, more companies and organizations and destinations coming on board, but we also need to show change, actual things happening about how the industry is changing, ways that we are addressing the reality of what decarbonizing looks like. And I mean, I've had 2 examples that have happened in these first couple of weeks that I think signify the sort of things that could happen, and they were totally unexpected to me, and they don't come necessarily from the central part of it. And one of those is, I mentioned Deutsche Bahn signed up, and they signed up last week, and they announced instantly that they were creating a business travel climate program there and then. And I don't speak good enough German to have I don't speak any German. So it's Google Translate that has given me what I've understood of it. But as I understand of it, they're basically promoting to their 1,000 largest corporate travel buyers on Deutsche Bahn 50% discounts in order to support them investing, shifting their travel over to train. Now, that's just, that's huge and instant and creates an enormous, that genuinely makes a difference. And then at the same time, Euronews, who've been incredibly supportive, and they're, this is a huge global news company, announced at COP that they were going to be prioritizing in their travel pages, prioritizing coverage of companies who had signed the Glasgow Declaration. So what you see is different pieces of the very complex ecosystem that is tourism, putting pieces in place that enable, that support, that encourage change. So we need to see more and more of those, and the more of them that happen, the more we begin to see what tourism could look like. And of course, it wasn't just, yes, we're focusing on the Glasgow Declaration, and hopefully that does provide a central framework that we can all find our place in. But there was much more that was launched at COP as well. WTTC launched a roadmap for major sectors to see how they can get to net zero. And their call to action is to sign the Glasgow Declaration, to join Tourism Declares. But that was WTTC putting huge amounts of work in and contributing that. Greenview, who probably the world's leading tourism consultancy working on sustainability, published the first net zero methodology for the accommodation sector. Intrepid, the only tour operator with an accredited science-based target, open sourced their methodology so as to say, this is how we did it. Here's what, let us help you all do that. And we need more and more of these things, because the conversations that we've had over the last 2 years as an unfunded Tourism Declares was always, great, we're in, we want to do this. How do we start? How do we measure? What should we do first? And we can't still be having that conversation in a year's time. And we need to have been able to say, here is how you measure. Here is best practice. The examples from Deutsche Bahn, from Intrepid, from Euronews, from so many others. Here is what you can build on, and see people putting it in place and building on it.
I mean, that's just fantastic that you're seeing actions in areas that you didn't even expect. So obviously, it's a very inspiring and exciting sort of piece of work to be involved in. And I guess I know that you also you've dedicated so much of your time to this. Are you going to be able to take a step back and maybe do some writing for a change? Because I know that you had to park that while you were working on Tourism Declares. Will you be able to do a few more things for yourself?
I think I had this naive idea that I'd be able to answer a question like that with a yes, and then the momentum that the last few weeks and the energy of the last few months, I think this is huge, and I can't imagine not being utterly committed and involved in this. You're totally right that I haven't written, well, in one sense, I haven't written anything since the last article I published was in February this year. That being said, I've spent the last 7 months chewing over 800 words with a bunch of people who are some of the most wonderful people I've ever had the chance to work with. I've written a lot of 800-word blogs and articles in my life. I've certainly never been given 6 months to refine the quality of the language. And it has been something, also, I've never had the chance to write a declaration before, or to be part of writing a declaration. So in one sense, I have been writing all along. But yeah, I hugely miss and look forward to writing some regular articles again soon. And I massively hope that, and intend that part of what I can contribute in the months to come will be on writing rather than just, talking. So.
And even, the perspective that you could bring, you could sort of do some kind of, book, an expose of how this has all happened, and that I for one would love to read that.
I would love to write it. I mean, the last book I wrote was published 3 years ago, and I love writing books, and I would very much, I mean, I'm not doing a plug, but if someone out there is a publishing company looking to publish a book on tourism and climate, and they'd like to have a chat about what's going on, I would love to have that conversation, because, yeah, I mean, whether it's something I'll be able to do next year or whether it's something to begin the conversations around, yeah, it's certainly something I would love to do.
Excellent. And I mean, when we look at COP, I've seen some sort of fairly negative headlines, like in the FT saying, well, it's never going to work. But do you feel positive that actually a lot was achieved at COP, and that we are on accelerating our path to net zero? And I mean, do you feel that tourism itself is going to make this work? Just wonder what your thoughts are.
Um, I've been so involved in what we've been doing with tourism that I haven't had a huge amount of time to pay much attention to the sort of wider, vital global conversations. And I mean, it's hard to feel hugely optimistic if it's taken us 25, 26 COPs to get reference to fossil fuels into the language. That said, things move, and windows of opportunity become ever wider, and maybe that widening has increased some more, and maybe the fact that the next COP27 is in Cairo, and so is in the global south and in Africa, will change the sort of the tenor of the conversation and enable those voices that continue to be not listened to enough and shut out to have a greater presence, and that would be vital. I do think that from my perspective, there was conversations around engaging in regeneration, engaging in the relevance and the connection, the inextricable connection of the climate emergency and the biodiversity emergency did seem to be more present this time. And maybe that is a possible, not maybe, it's a positive thing, and maybe that will help. From the perspective of tourism, I mean, I'm probably too close to it to know what the true potential, or what the true relevance of what we've done is. I do think it's incredibly important, and I do think we've made a very good start. But it's 2021. It's a bit late to be making a very good start. We've got an awful lot of catching up to do, and our industry continues to go through, but has been going through, as a result of COVID, the most enormous existential crisis. And there's been an awful lot of conversation about what comes next, and Build Back Better, and the new tourism, and sustainability is going to be at the heart of it. It's got to be a lot more than talk. It's now or never when it comes to what the rebirth of tourism looks like.
Yes, well, I think that's just very sort of impactful way to end our conversation today, and it's definitely, I feel inspired to go and sort of push for us to sign up to the Glasgow Declaration, and also to help you get the word out. So thank you so much, Jeremy. I wish you all the best, and I do hope that you manage to get that book published. It's been an absolute pleasure having you on the podcast today.
Thank you so much, Caroline. It's been an absolute pleasure to chat with you.